On a gray Tuesday morning in Chicago, a man in a worn wool coat walked into a real estate office on North Wells Street. His name was Gideon Ferraro. He was 34 years old, dark hair already going silver at the temples, and there was a long scar across the knuckles of his left hand that he'd never explained to anyone, not even to his wife. For 2 years, he'd ridden the number 9 bus to work every morning. He'd rented a single room above a laundromat on Emerald Street, kept his work boots by the door, and eaten the $2 soup at a diner nearby because it was hot and it was cheap. Camille had married him 6 years earlier, believing he'd amount to something. That morning, she decided he never would. She didn't wait for him to sit down. She didn't ask why he'd come. She stood up behind her desk, in front of every broker on that floor, and she threw the divorce papers straight into his face. 6 years, she said. 6 years of my life spent married to a man who can't even afford a car. Sign it. Don't make me look at you one more day. Preston Hale, the developer she'd been seeing since spring, laughed out loud and dropped a $20 bill onto the desk. Cab fare, he said. On me, pal. Gideon didn't raise his voice. He never did. He knelt down on that office carpet and picked up every single page, one at a time, and when he stood back up, he thanked her quietly for the years they'd had. Then he walked out into the rain without looking back. There was a folder in his coat pocket that morning, the federal clearance papers proving his assets were merely frozen, not lost. He'd carried it across the city to show her that his ruin was a shield to protect her. He never opened it. And not one person in that room, not the woman who'd just thrown paper in his face, not the man laughing beside her, had the slightest idea who they had just laughed at. Some men wear their power where everyone can see it. Others wear an old coat and let the whole world get it wrong. If you love stories about dignity and the true worth of a human being, leave us a like. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Holding those signed papers, Gideon stepped out into the storm, not just the rain outside, but the long-awaited turning point of his life. The Chicago rain in late October didn't fall straight down. It swept sideways, cutting into the faces of pedestrians like shards of broken glass. Gideon had walked barely half a block before the shoulders of his coat were soaked through, the old wool growing heavier against his back with every step he took. He didn't quicken his pace. He didn't look for an awning beneath which to shelter. People hurried past him, covering their heads with briefcases, handbags, and crumpled morning newspapers, and not one of them looked back at the man walking slowly through the rain as though the sun were shining. A black car pulled up to the curb, its tires slipping slightly on the wet pavement. The rear door opened. Sal Bianchi sat inside, both hands resting on his thighs, his silver hair neatly combed back. He said nothing, only nodded once toward the empty seat beside him. Gideon bent down and climbed in. Water dripped from his coat onto the carpet, leaving a dark stain. Sal handed him a dry towel. Gideon took it, but merely laid it across his lap, without wiping himself dry. The car merged into traffic, the windshield wipers moving in a steady rhythm of 2 beats, and for a long while, neither man spoke. Then Sal said, in the hoarse voice of a man who had been smoking since the days before anyone thought to ban it indoors, that the order lifting the freeze had been signed early that morning, that the lawyer had called 3 times, and that everything had now returned to its rightful place. Gideon kept looking out the window. Across the glass, raindrops streamed sideways in long diagonal lines. 2 years earlier, when the federal investigation began, he had sat in a different room, with different lawyers, and he had made a choice that no one in his household could understand. He didn't move his assets. He didn't hire anyone to fabricate records. He moved out of the house that bore his name, signed over its right of use to a trust that didn't carry the Ferraro name, then rented a single room above a laundromat and began taking the bus to work. He hadn't done it because he had run out of options. He had done it because he knew exactly how investigations like that worked. They didn't stop with the person being investigated. They spread outward, reaching into a wife's bank accounts, her professional license, and every contract she had signed during the 6 years she had carried her husband's name. The Ferraro name was enough to destroy an entire career in real estate brokerage in the course of a single afternoon, so he had made that name worthless. He let the entire city believe that Gideon Ferraro had lost everything, and throughout those 2 years, not a single investigator saw any reason to open a file on the woman who lived with a man who took public transit to a modest rented room. Sal knew all of it. He had been sitting in that room on that day. And now, as the car stopped at a red light on the avenue, He said in the calm voice of a man who had spent 40 years in that house, that the man who had laughed in the office that morning wouldn't live to see the next week's sunrise, that all it would take was a single nod, and everything would be handled so cleanly that the man himself wouldn't even have time to understand what was happening to him. He spoke of it the way a man might speak of clearing snow from his front steps. Gideon stared outside for a long time. The light turned green. The car rolled forward. Then he lowered his voice until it was quieter than the windshield wipers, and said that no one was to touch her. Sal turned toward him. Gideon continued slowly, saying that she wasn't wrong for leaving, that people had the right to walk away when they couldn't endure any more, that what she had been wrong about was the reason she chose to leave, and that wasn't something any phone call could repair. Sal remained silent for a moment. He had heard this man speak in many different voices over all those years, but he had learned long ago that the quietest one was the voice no one was permitted to defy. He added only one thing, that Gideon's uncle had been waiting at the house since morning, that he had finished 2 pots of coffee, and that he had asked 3 times where his nephew was. Gideon folded the dry towel, placed it neatly on the seat beside him, and didn't answer. The car turned off the avenue and followed the road as it sloped steadily downward, and ahead of them, beyond the gray curtain of rain, the harbor cranes began to emerge. Warehouse number 9 stood at the far end of the row, close to the water's edge, where the smell of engine oil mingled with the cold season scent of the river. Inside, a long wooden table had been set between stacks of pallets, and 3 men sat around it with 3 cups of coffee that had already gone cold. None of them stood when the door opened. That was the first thing Gideon noticed, and he gave no sign that he had noticed it. He took off his wet coat, draped it over the back of a chair, pulled the chair out, and sat down like a man arriving late to his own meeting. Sal remained by the door with his hands clasped behind his back. The man on the left was named Dolan, and he was in charge of the day shift. The man on the right was Keogh, and he oversaw the cold storage warehouse. The man in the middle was Mercer, and for the past 2 years, Mercer had been signing his name in the place where Gideon's signature should have been. Dolan spoke first, saying that the harbor had been running well all this time, that everything had settled into its proper order, and that changing things now wouldn't benefit anyone. Gideon nodded as though he agreed. Then he placed 3 folders on the table, arranging them side by side, 3 identical folders, not one thicker than the others. No one said a word. He opened only one of them, the folder in the middle, turned to the page whose corner had already been folded, and read aloud a single line. That line listed a date, an account number, the name of the funeral fund to which the dock workers contributed every month so that men in their profession could be laid to rest, and the amount of money that had left that fund and never returned. He read it in the voice of a man reading a train schedule. Mercer set down his coffee cup, and his hand trembled slightly as he did. He began saying something about an advance, and about the accounts from the previous summer still being in disorder. But Gideon had already taken out his phone and made a call. The call lasted no more than 15 seconds. He gave a name, gave an address, said thank you, then ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. The meeting continued. Dolan asked about the schedule for ships arriving the following month. Keogh asked about staffing for the night shift. Gideon answered both questions fully and without haste, as though the call he had just made had been nothing more than a dinner reservation. Then Mercer's phone vibrated for the first time. He glanced down, and the color drained from his face. It vibrated a second time. He turned it face down, but it vibrated a third time, and this time he didn't dare look. His company account had just been closed. The warehouse lease in his wife's name had just been terminated, and the transportation license he had spent 7 years obtaining had just been suspended pending review. Mercer looked up, his lips moving soundlessly before he asked Gideon what he intended to do. Gideon said he didn't intend to do anything at all. It had already been taken care of that morning. He said it no faster and no slower than anything he had said before. Then he closed the folder, pushed it aside, and slid the other 2 toward Dolan and Keogh. He said he hadn't read those 2 yet. He said whether they were ever read was up to the 2 of them. Neither man touched the folders. They lay motionless on the wooden table, exactly where Gideon had pushed them, and both men stared at them the way people stare at something that is ticking. Gideon stood, put his still damp coat back on, thanked the 3 men for their time, and walked toward the door. This time, all 3 of them stood. Outside, the rain had faded into a fine mist suspended in the air. Sal opened the car door, and once they were both seated inside, Gideon said that within a year, everything bearing the Ferraro name would be clean. The books would be clean, the contracts would be clean, and the people would be clean. No fund would ever be drained again without someone being able to answer where the money had gone. Sal didn't respond at once. He looked outside, where the cranes were lowering their arms through the mist, then said he had heard those words once before in his life, from Gideon's father on a winter evening, and 3 months later, that man could no longer say anything at all. He continued more slowly, saying that Gideon's uncle would never allow that to happen, that he had sat at the head of that table for far too long to accept anything clean. Gideon looked toward the water. He said his uncle would have to accept it. The car began to move, leaving the harbor behind and heading toward the old rooftops of Bridgeport, about 4 blocks west of the harbor, where the elevated train tracks cut across the sky and the grinding of steel wheels against the rails echoed down every 10 minutes. There was a small diner that stayed open all night beneath a red neon sign whose final letter had burned out. Josie Fletcher stood behind the counter, wiping the stainless steel backsplash with a faded cloth, and when someone at the far end of the row of stools called her name, she tilted her head to the right before turning around. She had been doing it for so long that she no longer realized she was doing it. When she was a child, her left ear had become infected again and again, returning every year, and each time the doctor said it needed proper treatment, her mother would sit for a long while at the kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of her, then buy another course of medicine, and promise they would save enough money for the next time. That next time never came. Now that ear could hear only a muffled blur of sound, like voices coming through a wall, and Josie had learned to turn her body so that the world always reached her from the right. The clock above the coffee machine showed that it was almost midnight. She had been standing there since 8 o'clock that evening. And before that, she had worked a shift in the hospital laundry. And before that, she had spent the morning cleaning offices in the Loop. 3 jobs, 3 different uniforms, 3 journeys along the same bus route every day. And at the end of every month, there was still 1 bill she had no idea how to pay. In the pocket of her apron was a letter folded into quarters. The bank had sent the first one in the spring, and its tone had still been courteous. The second had arrived in the middle of summer, and it had been shorter. This one began with bold print in the very first line, and beneath it was a deadline she had read so many times that she knew it by heart, yet still couldn't believe it applied to the house where she lived. At home, at the bottom of the lowest drawer in the cabinet in her mother's room, there was an envelope carefully sealed with tape around its edges. Inside was everything Josie had managed to save since the day she laid her mother to rest in the cemetery. 1 bill at a time, tips from crowded nights, holiday overtime pay, and the money she had saved by going without a new coat for 2 winters. She had never counted it again. She only knew it still wasn't enough, and with every passing month, it fell farther behind the amount demanded in that letter. The bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, brushing rainwater from his shoulders, and went straight to the last stool at the counter, the one against the wall, where he could see both the front door and the hallway leading to the kitchen. He was still wearing that same worn wool coat, the one Josie guessed he had worn through several winters. He ordered the same thing he always did, the cheapest bowl of soup on the menu. She ladled it out for him, then, when her back was turned, added another ladleful to his bowl, taking it from the thicker part near the bottom of the pot, where there was more meat and more potato, and she didn't add another line to his check. She had been doing that since the previous winter, ever since the night she saw him counting coins in the palm of his hand before placing them on the counter. She thought he was struggling just as she was. She thought he was one of those middle-aged men who worked night shifts in the warehouses along the river, the kind of man this city used until there was nothing left to take and then forgot, and she had decided long ago that as long as she stood behind that counter, no one would have to eat the thinnest part of the soup. He thanked her. He always thanked her. Once, she had asked his name, and he had said only Gid, nothing more, and she hadn't asked again, because in a diner that stayed open all night, people had the right to give only half of their names. What Josie didn't know, and wouldn't know for a long time, was that earlier that morning, a federal judge had signed a document returning to this man everything he had once possessed, and that he could have been seated at any dinner table in the city of Chicago that night. He came here because it was the only place he knew where no one had ever measured him by the coat he wore. He finished his soup, left money on the counter as he always did, and before walking out the door, he looked at her a little longer than usual, just as she tilted her head to the right to hear another customer asking for more coffee. He didn't leave. He stayed for another cup of coffee, seated on the last stool at the counter with his back to the wall, while the diner slowly emptied until all that remained was the heater shuddering at intervals and the sound of the final train passing overhead. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, beyond the glass door, an elderly man walking along the sidewalk suddenly slowed. He reached out for a lamppost but missed it, then collapsed, one shoulder striking the metal mailbox with a hard, hollow sound that carried all the way into the diner. 3 people passed him in the brief moments that followed. The first was a young man wearing headphones, who stepped around him without looking up. The second was a woman pulling a suitcase. She stopped for barely half a beat, then quickened her pace toward the train station. The third stopped longer than the others, looked down, took out his phone, then slipped it back into his pocket and continued walking. Later, Josie would think about those 3 people more often than she wanted to, not with hatred, but with a question she could never answer. What had made 3 ordinary human beings walk past someone who needed them? But in that moment, she didn't think at all. She saw the man through the glass, dropped the cleaning cloth onto the counter, yanked open the door, and ran outside with her apron still tied around her waist. The cold pavement bit through the thin fabric at her knees as she knelt beside him. She called out to him, then called again, lowering her right ear close to his face. There was no response. She placed one hand over the other, locked her fingers together, and began pressing down on his chest in the exact rhythm she had learned in the practice room at nursing school. During the final semester she had managed to complete before everything in her life fell apart. She counted silently in her head. She hadn't thought she would still remember, yet her hands remembered, her arms remembered, and that steady rhythm had remained somewhere inside her all along, rising now of its own accord. She pressed, counted, and pressed again as her hair slipped loose from its clip, and she didn't stop. Inside the diner, the man on the last stool had risen the moment he heard the impact against the mailbox. He didn't run outside. He took out his phone, dialed 3 numbers, and when someone answered, he began to speak. He gave the diner's street name and address, then the name of the nearest cross street, and clearly explained that it was east of the elevated railway, so the ambulance wouldn't have to circle back. He said the patient was an elderly man, unconscious on the sidewalk, that someone had already begun chest compressions, and that they had started at that very moment. His voice never rose. The dispatcher asked whether he was a medical professional. He said no. She asked him again because, during her shift, people calling for an ambulance at 2 o'clock in the morning usually screamed into the phone instead of reciting an address, in perfect order, as though dictating a statement to a secretary. He answered that no, he had only happened to be there, and asked her to send an ambulance. Then he stayed on the line, standing close to the glass door and looking outside, where a woman in an apron knelt in the middle of the cold sidewalk and drove the full weight of her body through the palms of her hands. That night, 2 people saved the same life in 2 entirely different ways. One used her body, the other used the skill life had taught him better than anything else, knowing exactly whom to call and what to say to make everything move in the right direction. Neither of them realized it, and neither understood what the other had done. The siren arrived several minutes later, stretching down the wet street as red lights swept across the fronts of the closed doors. The paramedics jumped out, and one of them placed a hand on Josie's shoulder and told her to move back, but she continued for several more compressions before finally letting go, her arms trembling violently as she pulled them away. They lifted the man onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics asked whether anyone was family. Josie stood there with her hair clinging to her forehead and her apron stained with dirt, and said she would go with him. She climbed into the ambulance. The rear doors closed. No one noticed the man in the old wool coat leaving the diner afterward, and no one noticed the black car pulling up to the curb a short distance away and taking him with it. At the hospital, he didn't enter the waiting room. He sat on a plastic chair at the far end of the corridor, where the white light spilled across the tiled floor, far enough away that no one would notice him, and close enough to see the door through which they had just pushed the stretcher. He sat there all night without saying a single word to anyone. Dawn was beginning to break when the doctor on duty stepped into the corridor, and the first thing he told Josie was that the old man had survived the crisis. She dropped heavily onto a chair and covered her face with both hands, and for those few seconds, she thought it was over. Then the doctor sat in the chair beside her and told her the part that was harder to hear. The old man's heart could no longer maintain its own rhythm. He needed a device implanted in his chest to keep it beating, followed by a long period of rehabilitation in a specialized facility, with supervision, medication, and physical therapy. Josie asked when it could be done. The doctor was silent for a moment before saying that the old man had no insurance, no relatives who could be found in his records, and no one willing to sign as his guarantor. He said the law required the hospital to provide emergency treatment, regardless of what a patient had in his pockets. And that was exactly what they had done. They had saved him, but the law didn't require them to keep him once his condition had been stabilized. Then he said the words Josie would hear again in her mind many times afterward, that they had saved him, but they had no right to keep him. In 3 days, someone would wheel him to the front entrance, hand him a bag of medication and a paper with a follow-up appointment, then leave him on the sidewalk with a heart that could beat just long enough to carry him to the end of the block. Josie asked how much it would cost. The doctor handed her a piece of paper with a number written on it. She looked at it, folded it, and slipped it into her apron pocket beside the letter from the bank. She took the bus home before the sky was fully light. She opened the door to her mother's room, pulled out the lowest drawer of the cabinet, and took out the envelope sealed with tape around its edges. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with it in her hands. There was no one whose advice she could ask. There was no one she could tell that she was about to do this, and ask whether they thought it was right. She peeled away the tape, and she didn't count the money. She carried the entire envelope back to the bus stop. At the hospital cashier's counter, the woman behind the glass counted it twice, then looked up and asked how Josie was related to the patient. Josie said she was no one to him. The woman asked for her name so it could be entered into the records, so there would be someone to contact later. Josie shook her head and walked away before the woman could ask again. 2 weeks later, a notice was posted on the door of the house where Josie had grown up. It listed the auction date and the name of the bank, and it had been attached with tape that took her forever to scrape away. She had known this day would come. She simply hadn't known it would come so quickly. She walked through every room and soon realized that she had nowhere to take any of the belongings, so she packed only 2 things. The first was a yellowed recipe card bearing her mother's sloping handwriting, with the recipe for the cake she used to bake on Sunday mornings. The second was her father's old tape measure, the one he had clipped to his belt every day when he went to work, the one he had been wearing on the morning he left the house and never returned. They had told Josie and her mother that it was a workplace accident. They had said there would be compensation. That money never came, and 4 years later, her mother died in a hospital room with the stack of bills still lying untouched on the bedside table. Josie placed both things in a cloth bag, locked the door, and returned the key through the mail slot. That night, she slept in her old car in the hospital parking lot, the seat reclined and her coat pulled up to her chin, because it was the closest she could get to the old man. The following morning, in a room on the 4th floor, the old man opened his eyes and asked the nurse changing his intravenous fluids who had paid for his care. The nurse stopped what she was doing. She said a young woman had come in the other day. The old man asked what her name was. The nurse said she hadn't left one. The old man's name was Walter Kemp, and Josie learned that on the 3rd day, when she stopped by his hospital room with 2 cups of coffee and found him awake enough to talk. From then on, every morning before her shift in the laundry, she visited the 4th floor for about 15 minutes, long enough to ask whether he had slept well the night before and to listen as he told her small, scattered stories about the years he had driven a bus on the night route. The surgery was over. He had been transferred to the rehabilitation unit. No one mentioned the money again, and Josie didn't ask. Then, one afternoon near the end of the month, an envelope addressed to her arrived at the diner. Inside were documents from a community assistance fund whose name she had never heard, along with a copy of the auction record and a form on which every space had already been completed, except the signature line. The house where she had grown up had been bought back. It was now registered in the fund's name, and the fund was offering to transfer ownership to her with no conditions and no loan attached. She read everything 3 times in the diner kitchen amid the clatter of dishes, then folded the papers and asked the courier for the office address. 2 days later, she sat across from a man in a small room on the 2nd floor of an old building near the river. She placed the documents on the desk and pushed them toward him. He looked down at them, then back at her. She said she wouldn't take the house. He asked why. She told him that the house was the only thing her mother had left behind, that the bank had been able to take, and that if she accepted it now from the hands of a stranger, she still wouldn't truly possess it. She would only be borrowing it from someone's pity. She said her mother had made the payments on that house through nights spent baking and mornings when she rose before the church bells, and if Josie wanted it back, she had to pay for it with something of equal worth, not with a signature. The man sat silently. He could have told her that this fund had been established for people in situations exactly like hers, that it wasn't charity but a system, that she was refusing something thousands of people outside that room would willingly trade an entire year of their lives to receive. He said none of it. He asked what she needed. Josie was silent for a moment, then said she needed a job. Not another temporary position, not a night shift that paid cash at the end of the week. She needed a job with insurance and regular hours, and if possible, tuition assistance, because she had only one semester left to complete the nursing degree she had abandoned. She said she wasn't asking anyone to help her survive. She was only asking for a place firm enough that she could stand up on her own. The man didn't argue with a single word. He opened a drawer, took out another sheet of paper, and asked whether she could begin the following week. He said the medical clinic at the harbor was short-staffed on the night shift, that the work wasn't easy but came with full insurance, and that there was a tuition assistance program for employees who hadn't finished their studies. Josie looked at him, searching his face for some sign of pity, and she found none. She signed. After she walked out the door, the man remained seated there for a long while, one hand resting on the documents she had pushed back toward him. For the past 2 years, he had awakened at the same hour, taken the same bus, done whatever needed to be done, and no morning had been any different from the one before it. That afternoon, for the first time in all those years, something made him wish tomorrow would come a little sooner. The Southline Harbor Medical Station was a square room lined with white tile, wedged between the dispatch building and the row of cold storage warehouses. It held 2 folding cots, a medicine cabinet secured with a key, and a window overlooking containers stacked upon one another like buildings without doors. Josie took the night shift, from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Most of the work involved the small injuries and ailments that came with a place where people labored with their hands in the cold, fingers caught in doors, ankles twisted on slick iron steps, cuts that needed a few stitches, and coughs that had lasted an entire month, while the men suffering from them stubbornly insisted they were caused by the weather. She liked the job more than she had expected. The people there called her Miss Fletcher, and they listened to her, and for the first time in many years, she had an employee badge bearing her own photograph. On the employment papers she had signed that day, in the space reserved for the employer, there had been only an abbreviated signature and a surname she had glanced at and immediately forgotten, because to her, it was merely one company name among dozens of company names along that waterfront. On the 9th night after she began, the medical station door flew open close to 2 o'clock in the morning, and a man stepped inside before having to brace one hand against the doorframe. Josie looked up and recognized him at once. He was the customer who always sat on the last stool at the counter. His face was gray, his lips were dry, and by the time she rose, he was already gripping the edge of the table to keep his balance. 2 men who had come with him stood in the corridor, both as motionless as pillars. He said he only needed to sit down for a moment. Josie didn't respond to that. She pulled the chair out of his way, pointed toward the folding cot, and told him to lie down. He began saying something about a meeting. She cut him off and told him to remove his coat. He stopped. She repeated herself, no louder than before, but in the voice of someone standing in her own room who had no intention of negotiating, telling him to take off his coat and lie down. In the corridor, one of the 2 men shifted slightly, then went still again. Gideon removed his coat. He lay down. She checked his blood pressure, took his pulse, shone a light into his eyes, and asked when he had last slept. He said he couldn't remember. She asked again, 3 nights ago or 4. He said probably 3. She placed a cup of water in his hand and told him to finish it, then ordered him to remain still, not to speak, and not to look at his phone for at least an hour. He asked what would happen if he didn't stay in bed. She said that, if he refused, she would write in her shift report that a man had arrived at the medical station suffering from exhaustion and had refused to rest, and that report would end up on the desk of someone higher up, adding that she didn't care who that person was. A long silence followed. In all his years at this harbor, no one had ever spoken to him in that voice. People spoke to him cautiously, flatteringly, or with fear they tried to conceal, and every one of those voices raised a distance between him and the person standing before him, a distance he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer noticed it. This woman was different. She stood there with a clipboard in her hand, waiting for him to finish the water, and there was nothing in her eyes except a nurse's genuine irritation with a difficult patient. He finished it. He lay still. He closed his eyes and fell asleep on the folding cot in that white-tiled room for nearly 3 hours, longer than any sleep he had managed to get all week. When he awoke, dawn had not yet broken, and she had covered him with the station's thin blanket. He lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, and he understood that she was the only person at the harbor who wasn't afraid of him, simply because she didn't know she was supposed to be. He left the medical station as dawn began to break, then stopped for a while beside the crane tracks running close to the water's edge. From there, looking south, the entire waterfront stretched beneath the silver-gray light of early morning, one crane after another, rows of containers stacked high into blocks of color that continued as far as the eye could see, and at the far end, a cargo ship was being towed into the lock. Everything he could see from where he stood to the place where the water curved beyond sight bore a single name, and that name was his. The car took him back to the house on the hill west of the city. In the dining room, his uncle was already seated at the head of the long table with a cup of coffee and an unopened newspaper before him. Rocco Ferraro had occupied that seat since before Gideon had learned to read. He didn't rise or offer a greeting. He merely waited until his nephew pulled out a chair, then began to speak. He said he had heard what happened at warehouse number 9. He said the way Gideon had handled it was clean and beyond criticism, but the announcement he made at the end of the meeting was what had kept Rocco awake all night. He asked whether his nephew understood what the word clean meant. Clean meant opening the books. Opening the books meant allowing outsiders to look inside, and once they had looked at one page, they would turn through the entire volume, including the pages written while Gideon's father was still alive, including those written when Rocco himself had still been begging for work at the harbor. He said this house had survived until now not because anyone had been decent, but because someone had been willing to stand in the darkness so others could remain in the light, and he had stood there his entire life, without ever asking anyone for a single word of gratitude. He said that for the past 2 years, his nephew had ridden the bus and eaten in diners, and Rocco respected that. But someone had been required to keep the harbor running while his nephew was away. Now his nephew had returned intending to tear everything open because of some gnawing guilt, and that was no longer a matter that belonged to him alone. Gideon listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once. Only when Rocco paused to drink his coffee did Gideon speak. He said this house would be clean. He said the books would be opened one by one, and whatever had been taken from others would be returned to them. Even if returning it meant the Ferraro name would have to stand before a judge. He said he wasn't doing this because of guilt. He was doing it because he had spent 2 years sitting in a rented room, watching what this name could take from people when no one was looking at it, and he had seen enough. Rocco set down his coffee cup very softly. He didn't become angry. He merely said that Gideon's father had once sat in that very chair and said almost the same thing. Then he folded the newspaper, rose, and left the room without another word. At noon, the housekeeper opened the door to the dressing room upstairs and pulled away the protective cloth. Inside, a long row of suits, custom-tailored for Gideon, still hung neatly arranged by color, perfectly smooth without a single crease, each one bearing his name embroidered discreetly inside the breast pocket. Gideon stood looking at them for a while. Then he closed the wardrobe door, picked up the weathered coat draped over the back of a chair, pulled it over his shoulders, and walked downstairs. The bid presentation was scheduled for 9 o'clock on Thursday morning in the large conference room on the top floor of the operations building overlooking the waterfront, and Preston Hale walked in with the bearing of a man who already knew he was going to win. Camille walked beside him with the document case held against her chest, and she paused for half a beat at the door to adjust her collar. Their project was called Southline, a complex of high-rise apartments overlooking the river, and to build it, they needed access rights to a stretch of waterfront that only one name in the entire city had the authority to grant them. Several people were already seated along both sides of the long table. The chair at the head of the table faced away from the door and toward the windows. Preston set down his briefcase and began making small talk about the weather, and then the chair turned around. Camille dropped the document case onto the table. The sound of it falling could be heard throughout the room. Preston looked at the man seated at the head of the table, then at Camille, then back at the man, and gave a short laugh as though waiting for someone to explain what kind of game this was. No one said anything. Gideon invited them to sit. He said he had read the project documents, both the version submitted the previous month and the revised version sent the week before, and he invited Preston to give his full presentation. Preston did. He spoke for about 20 minutes, his voice gradually recovering its rhythm, and when he finished, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. Gideon thanked him. Then he opened the folder in front of him and began speaking in an even, unhurried tone that betrayed no emotion. He stated that over the past 3 weeks, a private investment firm under his control had quietly acquired every major note and line of credit Hale Group held across 3 separate banks. He added that due to uncured covenants, default notices had been executed at midnight, officially terminating 3 heavy equipment leases supporting Preston's primary sites, with recovery trucks dispatched at 7 that morning. Hale Group didn't owe the banks anymore, they owed him. Preston opened his mouth. Gideon continued without speaking any faster. He said an entire crew at the southern construction site had been owed wages since spring, that some of those workers had been forced to withdraw their children from extra classes, while others had sold their cars, and that their complaints had been filed in 3 different places without receiving an answer from any of them. He said that every dollar they were owed had been paid in full that morning, including interest for the delay, and he made it clear that Preston wasn't the one who had paid them. The color of Preston's face changed slowly, like a wall absorbing water. He asked Gideon what he wanted. Gideon pushed a sheet of paper across the table. He said Preston had exactly one way to avoid losing everything. Sign the paper, transfer all those workers to Gideon's company, preserve their seniority, provide them with insurance, and give them the benefits they should have received from the beginning. He said Preston had 8 minutes, and he stated the number not as a threat, but as a man announcing the departure time of a train. Then he folded his hands and sat in silence. No one in the room moved. The sound of cranes drifted up from the harbor below. Preston looked at the paper, then searched the faces around the table for someone who would take his side, and found no one. He picked up the pen, set it down, then picked it up again, and signed. When he finished, his hand remained on the table for a long while, as though he no longer knew what to do with it. Gideon thanked him, rose, and said their lawyers would handle the rest. Camille remained seated from beginning to end. She hadn't spoken a single word. She had sat there and watched the man she had called a failure, the man whose face she had thrown papers into before an entire office floor, buy out the whole life of her new lover before lunchtime. He had crossed half the underground parking garage when he heard her shoes striking the concrete behind him. Camille called his name, then called again, and by the time he stopped, she had come close enough for him to see that the makeup at the corners of her eyes had begun to smear. She said she hadn't known. She said it 3 times in 3 different ways, that she truly hadn't known, that no one had told her a single word, that for 2 years she had lived in that rented apartment and counted every dollar like an abandoned woman, and that if she had known, everything would have been entirely different. She said he had deceived her. Then she said the final thing, holding both hands out before her as though trying to catch something that was slipping away, that if he had told her from the beginning, she would never have walked out that door. Gideon listened to all of it. Then he said that was the worst thing she had just admitted. She asked what he meant. He said she had just told him exactly what had kept her there, and exactly what had driven her away, and neither of those things had been him. He said that during those 6 years, there had been evenings when he came home and she asked how his day had gone, and he had always understood that what she really meant was whether anything had improved that day, not whether he was tired. He said that when a woman left her husband because she couldn't endure any more, it was her right, and he would never resent a woman for that. But she hadn't left him because she couldn't endure any more. She had left because she had added up everything he possessed and decided the total was too small. Camille stood motionless. He continued, his voice softening, saying that he didn't deny his own share of the blame. He had hidden the truth from her for 6 years. He had decided for her how much truth she could bear and how much she couldn't, and he had never once asked what she wanted. He said he had done it because he believed that was how he could keep her safe, but the true name for it was still lying, and he would carry that wrong with him until the end of his life, even if they never saw each other again. He said he wasn't angry with her. He simply had nothing left to say to her. Camille stepped back half a pace. Something hardened in her face, the expression he had seen many times during those 6 years whenever she was about to lose a contract and decided that she wouldn't. She said he could think of her as the kind of woman who chased money if he wanted, but her project was real, the documents were real, and she had earned it through the strength of her own mind. She said the key piece of land couldn't simply be bought on the open market, that it was an old work site abandoned for many years, assembled long ago and kept intact while waiting for the right moment, and that there weren't many people in this city who could get their hands on a property like that. He asked which site. She spoke the name like someone throwing down a final card. Kedzie Yards. Then she turned, walked toward her car, and the sound of her shoes gradually faded before disappearing behind a closing door. Gideon remained standing in the middle of the underground parking garage. The ceiling lights hummed above him. He knew that name, He had seen it somewhere it should never have appeared, in a ledger that no one in his family had been willing to open for many years. The following Monday morning, he had 4 boxes of old accounting records brought up to his office from the basement archive, their pages yellow with age and bound into volumes by year. He locked the door and began with the thinnest volume. Kedzie Yards was located on the southwest side of the city, a construction site where his family's company had contracted to build the structural frame, and it had ceased operating so long ago that only a single brief entry remained among countless others in the books. He began tracing the record backward. The safety reports from that summer showed that a set of locking pins on the scaffolding in the eastern section had failed, and it had been documented not once, but repeatedly, week after week, with the same description and the same red checkmark in the margin. There were 3 requests to halt construction, so the entire locking system could be replaced, each signed by the site safety supervisor. All 3 had been stamped as received. All 3 had stopped at the same desk and gone no farther, and the man seated behind that desk had signed a brief directive ordering the work to continue because the contract was behind schedule. 3 weeks after the final request, a worker fell from the scaffolding in the eastern section. The report classified it as a workplace accident. The records showed that compensation had been approved for the man's family, an amount large enough to pay off a mortgage with a little left over. Gideon followed the money across 4 pages. It left the company account, entered an intermediary legal entity registered in the suburbs under the name of some materials service company, and then disappeared. 3 people were listed under that entity, and all 3 were the driver, the guard, and the secretary of the same person in Gideon's family. He recognized the signature at the bottom of the page. He had seen it on his own birth certificate. He turned to the personnel list to find the name of the worker who had fallen, and there he stopped. Fletcher, Ray. He sat in that room for a very long time. Outside the window, darkness fell. Then the harbor lights came on, one cluster at a time. Then the horn of some distant ship carried across the water, and still he remained seated with one finger resting on that name. He thought of a woman who tilted her head to the right whenever someone called her name. He thought of the envelope sealed with tape that she had carried to the hospital cashier, and the name she had refused to leave behind. He thought of what she had told him in the small room on the 2nd floor, that she wouldn't take anything she hadn't earned. Then he opened the door, called the lawyer, and over the next 3 days, he did 3 things. First, every unpaid wage owed to former workers from every construction site, bearing his family's name, was reviewed and paid in full, without excluding a single person, even those who had left the profession long ago. Second, he established a restitution fund for the families of workers who had suffered past workplace accidents, reopening every case one by one, including those that had been closed and those people had stopped asking about. Third, he ordered that Josie Fletcher's name be added to the review board for that fund. He clearly explained the scope of her role to the lawyer, that she would have access to the record system so she could read the applications, verify the information, and recommend whether each case should be approved or denied, and that she didn't and never would have any authority over the release of funds, because money could leave the fund only with the signatures of 2 people in the finance department. He said he didn't want those applications reviewed by someone sitting in an accounting office. He wanted them read by someone who had once held a letter from the bank in her hands and knew exactly how heavy it could be. And there was one thing he didn't do. He didn't tell her. He told himself that he would tell her once he had found enough documents to place before her at the same time as the truth, so she wouldn't have to receive that news with empty hands. That was the first day. On the 4th day, Josie was called to the operations building to sign the remaining papers for the review board. She went up to the 3rd floor, walked along the corridor, and found the door to the final office slightly ajar instead of fully closed. She was about to knock. She raised her hand, then stopped, because voices were coming from inside, and the man speaking had the same voice as the one she had ordered onto the folding cot in the medical station, except it didn't sound the way it had that night. It was lower and steadier, and there wasn't a single opening in it where the listener could fit a question. A man stood inside the room with his arms hanging at his sides, and through the narrow opening, Josie could see the way his shoulders had folded forward. Gideon remained seated. He said he knew. He named a transportation company on the far side of the city, gave a date, gave a time, and even named the coffee shop where the meeting had taken place, reciting each detail the way someone might read from an inventory list. The other man began talking about his wife needing surgery and the months when he had been unable to find enough money, and his voice broke in the middle of the sentence. Gideon allowed him to finish. Then he said the tuition for the man's 2 children would still be paid in full from now until the day they completed their education, just as it had been for the previous 3 years, because the children hadn't done anything wrong. The man looked up. Gideon continued. He said the man's name would never again be spoken in that house. He wouldn't stand at that harbor, pass through its gates, or sit at any table where someone from that house was seated, and if anyone asked about him, no one would answer. He said the tuition check would still arrive at the beginning of every term as regularly as before, except it would no longer bear the man's name, and he would never be permitted to tell anyone where it came from. He said that was what the man had just traded for the money he had taken. The man remained standing there for a while longer without arguing a single word, and when he left the office, he walked past Josie without seeing her. Josie remained outside the door. Both her hands had gone cold. Something moved along her spine that she couldn't name, and she realized she was holding her breath. Gideon looked up and saw her. He didn't ask how long she had been standing there. He rose, invited her inside, and pushed the folder toward her as though what had just happened was over and had been put back in its proper place. She didn't sit down. She said she had just watched him take something from a man that money could never buy back. Gideon didn't answer immediately. She continued, saying that the man would still have money to educate his children and food to eat, but from that day forward, he would walk through the city like someone without a name, and there wasn't a bank anywhere that could lend him enough to buy it back. She asked whether he understood what he had just done. Gideon said he did. He didn't deny a single word. He said the man had sold the ship schedules and the roster of employees assigned to the night shift in the cold storage area, and that her name was among the names on that list. Then he said he would do exactly the same thing again if he had to. Josie picked up the folder. She didn't sign it there. She said she would read it carefully and bring it back downstairs afterward, then walked out into the corridor, and throughout the entire descent down the stairs, she didn't look back once. That evening, in the waiting room of the rehabilitation unit, the television mounted in the corner was showing the 7 o'clock news, and Josie sat beneath it with an unopened meal box on her lap, waiting for visiting hours to begin. The anchor was reporting on the largest workforce transfer agreement in the city's construction industry in many years, and the screen changed to footage from the lobby of the operations building overlooking the waterfront. A line of people walked out. He was in the middle of them. The camera captured him for only a few seconds, and he said nothing to it, but the caption at the bottom of the screen remained long enough for her to read every word: his full name, his title, the name of the corporation. She had seen that name on the sign at the harbor gate every night she went to work, and at the top of every page in the folder she had taken home the day before, yet she had never once connected it to the man who always sat on the last stool at the counter. The meal box remained untouched on her lap. She sat there until the news ended, then rose, went straight to the bus stop, and took the final bus toward the waterfront. She found him in his office on the 3rd floor. She didn't knock. She asked him what his name was, and he gave it to her in full, without avoiding a single syllable. Then he invited her to sit, and he told her everything. He began at the beginning, telling her about the harbor, about what his family had done along that waterfront since his grandfather's time, about contracts people hadn't dared refuse to sign, and about the things that had passed through warehouse number 9 for years without anyone asking to see the documents. He told her about the previous 2 years, about the freeze order, the room above the laundromat, and why he had chosen to live that way. He didn't embellish any part of it. There were moments when he stopped because the words were difficult to say, and still he said them. Josie listened to everything without interrupting once. When he finished, she sat silently for a long time. She didn't shout. She said she had thought he was struggling just as she was. She said that throughout an entire winter, she had added the thickest part from the bottom of the pot to his bowl of soup, without putting it on the check, because she believed he was a man working night shifts in the warehouses and counting every coin, while all that time he had sat there owning the entire harbor outside. She said she wasn't angry because he was rich. She said what humiliated her was that he had sat there and watched her pity him. Then she stood and walked out. And this time, he didn't try to stop her. 3 days later, she sat beside Walter's bed and told him everything. When the old man had heard it all, he folded the newspaper on his lap and remained silent for a while. Then he asked whether Gideon had ever taken anything from her. She said no. He asked whether Gideon had ever forced her to accept something she didn't want. She said no to that as well. She had returned it, and he had never tried to force her, not even once. The old man nodded, then looked at her and asked a third question. whether she was angry because Gideon was rich or because he hadn't trusted her enough to tell her the truth. Josie opened her mouth to answer, then discovered that she couldn't. She stayed with Walter for another half-hour, and that night, she lay on the folding bed in her newly rented room and stared at the ceiling until morning. The following afternoon, she returned to the 3rd floor. She didn't sit down. She said that if he wanted her to stay, there was one condition, and that condition had nothing to do with her. She said his name had moved through this city for many years, taking things from people that they could never reclaim, and she wanted him to make it right, not with her, but with every one of those people. She said she didn't care how much it cost or how long it took. She only needed to know that he would open every file one by one and wouldn't stop at any of them, even if the name in the file belonged to someone in his own family. Gideon stood. He said he agreed. He said the work had already begun. And he didn't tell her that one of those people bore the name Fletcher. The summonses were sent on Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, everyone had gathered in the dining room of the house on the hill. The table was long enough to seat 13 people, and in that house, every seat was filled only when something had to be decided. Rocco sat at the head of the table. No one told him to sit there, and no one asked why he occupied that place while his nephew was walking into the room. Gideon pulled out the chair at the opposite end and sat down. Rocco briefly explained the reason for the meeting. He said changes were taking place without anyone at that table having been consulted, that those changes affected the money and safety of every person seated there, and that according to the customs of their house, when something like that happened, the table would decide. Then he invited his nephew to speak. Gideon did. He spoke about opening the books one volume at a time, beginning with the oldest. He spoke about the restitution fund, reopening old workplace accident cases, including those that had been closed many years before. He said every operation at the harbor would be formally documented within 1 year, that profit margins would grow thinner, that certain business relationships would have to be abandoned, and he even named the people who would have to be left behind. He said anyone who wished to withdraw could do so, and that person's share would be paid in full. No one would be forced to remain. He spoke for about 15 minutes. He made no promises, and he didn't ask anyone for a vote. When he finished, the sound of a glass being placed on the wooden table carried through the room. Rocco said that according to tradition, anyone who agreed should place a hand on the table. He spoke in the voice of a man reciting the evening prayer. Then he waited. The first person to place his hand on the table was an old man seated near the far end, someone who had worked in the cold storage warehouse while Gideon's father was still alive. The second was a man about Gideon's age seated on the right. Then came a long silence. Josie would never know what happened in that room, but if she had been there, she would have understood at once that the silence weighed more than any shout. A third hand came down. Then nothing. Several people stared at the surface of the table. One man took out a handkerchief and spent a long time cleaning his glasses. Another raised his hand halfway, then returned it to his lap. Sal stood against the wall without the right to vote, looking directly at each face in turn, and not one of them looked back at him. 3 hands rested on the wood. 10 did not. Rocco counted them slowly with his eyes, then said the table had decided. Gideon didn't rise. He remained seated with both hands resting on the table and looked around the room once, not with anger, but simply looking, like a man committing everything to memory. Several people began pushing back their chairs. No one left the room. Rocco reached for the water pitcher, poured more into his glass, set the pitcher down neatly, then asked his nephew what he intended to do now. He asked it with the cold composure of a man who had already anticipated the outcome. At that moment, the phone in Sal's pocket vibrated. He took it out, looked at the screen, and said nothing for several seconds. And the way he said nothing made everyone at the table turn toward him. He stepped behind Gideon and bent down to speak into his ear. Federal agents had arrived at the Southline Harbor Medical Station shortly before 3 o'clock that afternoon. A sum of money, an amount large enough to send someone to prison, had left the restitution fund's account during the night and been routed through a series of transfers until it disappeared. The entire sequence had been initiated from a login session under the name Josie Fletcher, using the same access to the records system that Gideon himself had ordered them to grant her. They had taken her away. Gideon placed both hands on the edge of the table and stood. He didn't answer his uncle's question. He walked past the entire length of that table, past the 13 people who had just decided his fate, and out the door. Behind him, Rocco lifted his glass, took a sip of water, and remained the only person in the room who didn't appear surprised. The room on the 4th floor of the federal building contained a metal table, 3 chairs, and a narrow window overlooking the wall of the building next door. Josie sat there alone for a long time before anyone entered. Her hands rested on the cold tabletop, and they were trembling. Not from fear, but in the way the hands of someone trembled after standing through an entire night shift, being taken straight there, and not having eaten anything. The door opened. A woman in her late 40s entered with an investigator, placed a folder on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. She introduced herself as Marlene Ruiz, a federal prosecutor. She opened the folder and began reading the formal procedures, and when she reached the line naming the person under investigation, she paused for exactly half a beat. She raised her eyes to Josie. She looked at her a little longer than such a glance required. Then she lowered her gaze and continued reading without saying anything. Josie tilted her head to the right so she could hear clearly. Miss Ruiz explained what had happened. A sum of money had left the restitution fund's account sometime between Monday night and Tuesday morning, passed through 4 successive transfers, and disappeared. The sequence had been initiated from a login session under the name Josie Fletcher on a computer within the internal system at 2:17 in the morning, at the exact time she was working her shift. Josie said she had no authority to transfer money, that she only read applications and gave her recommendations, and that money could leave the fund only with 2 signatures from the finance department. Miss Ruiz said she knew. She said that was precisely the significant point, because someone had used Josie's access to the records to open a path that should never have been accessible, and according to the documents, Josie was the person who had opened it. Then she removed a sheet of paper from the folder, placed it in front of Josie, and turned it so she could read it. It was a statement that had already been typed in full from beginning to end, leaving only the signature line blank. It stated that the person making the declaration confirmed she had performed the actions in question under the direct instruction of Mr. Gideon Ferraro, that he had ordered her to do it, and that she had complied because of pressure at work. Miss Ruiz said that if Josie signed it, every charge against her would be dismissed completely that very day. She said she had read Josie's personal file, that she knew Josie had just lost her home, that she knew she was sleeping in a room rented by the week, that she had no private lawyer, and no one willing to act as her guarantor. She said Josie didn't owe that man anything. Josie read the statement slowly from beginning to end, twice. Then she pushed it back to the center of the table. She said she had spent her entire life surrounded by people who walked away as soon as things became difficult. She said her father had gone to work one morning and never returned, and that she and her mother had been told it was an accident, and she had grown up believing that somewhere, someone had sat down, made a calculation, and decided that paying for a safety pin would cost more than not paying for it. She said she didn't know what that man had done in his life, and Miss Ruiz could investigate him to the very end, and if he was guilty, Josie would stand there and watch him pay for it. But she wouldn't sign a statement saying he had told her to do something he had never told her to do. She said that if she signed it, she would become just one more person sitting down to calculate which choice was cheaper. Miss Ruiz said nothing. She pulled the statement back, placed it inside the folder, and closed the cover. The court-appointed lawyer assigned to Josie entered about half an hour later, and he told her the only thing she would remember from that entire afternoon, that the grand jury would convene on Friday morning, and once it issued an indictment, no one could take it back. Even if she were later proven innocent, her name would still have appeared on it. She was released on bail close to 7 o'clock that evening. Someone had posted the money without leaving a name. She left the building, walked 3 blocks to the parking lot, and climbed into her old car. She didn't start the engine. She took out her phone and opened the voice message she had kept for all those years, without ever listening to the end, the final message her mother had left her, less than half a minute long. She held the phone to her right ear and pressed play. This time, she listened to all of it. From Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, the lights in the 3rd-floor office remained on until dawn. Gideon's lawyer brought a copy of the transfer chain reconstructed by the investigators, and they began working backward from the final destination. The money had passed through 4 accounts, 3 of which belonged to intermediary entities established less than 6 months earlier, with no employees and no operations. The 4th was different. It was a personal account that had been open for many years, with an extensive transaction history. And when the lawyer scrolled backward through the statements in search of unusual entries from previous years, he stopped at one line and turned the screen toward Gideon. 2 years earlier, in the fall, a payment had entered that account from a federal agency under the disbursement code for a program that compensated informants. The account belonged to Camille Ashford, No one in the room said anything. The lawyer reopened the timeline of the asset freeze, placed the two dates beside each other, and the distance between them was short enough that no one needed to ask another question. She had submitted the information first. The investigation had begun afterward, and that payment had been her reward, issued entirely according to procedure, complete with its code and date, sitting neatly in the records like every other lawful transaction. Gideon sat for a long time with the printed statement in his hands. He thought about the 2 years he had spent in the room above the laundromat. He thought about the mornings when he had stood waiting for the number 9 bus in the January wind. He thought about the office floor on North Wells Street and the papers he had picked up one by one. That woman had created his poverty with her own hands, then lived inside it for 2 years without knowing it was her own creation, and finally divorced him because of it. Sal stood at the window with his back to the room, and he waited until the lawyer had left before speaking. He said there was something he had never told Gideon. He said that during the fall of that year, several weeks before the freeze order was signed, meetings had taken place to which Gideon hadn't been invited. Sal didn't name anyone, but he said the man seated at the head of the table had decided that the chair needed a new occupant, and that almost everything had already been arranged. Then, the investigation began. From that day forward, no one in the family had dared touch a man who was under federal scrutiny, because touching him would have dragged the entire house into it. Sal said that throughout those 2 years, what had kept his nephew alive wasn't anyone's wisdom. It was that freeze order. Gideon placed the printed statement on the desk. He lowered himself into the chair and remained silent for a long time. He had entered that room carrying a clear and unmistakable anger, the anger he had kept carefully hidden since that Tuesday morning on North Wells Street. And now, when he searched for it, it was gone. The woman who had sold him for a payment was also the person who, without ever knowing it, had raised the only wall that kept him alive for 2 years. He sat there until daylight began to gather beyond the window, and he realized that he could no longer truly hate her. At 4 o'clock on Thursday morning, 2 small trucks backed up to the private warehouse at the north end of the harbor, and men began carrying out boxes of records. They contained the entire internal archive of the Ferraro house, documents that had never left that property, and they were being taken to Gideon's lawyer's office so they could be reviewed before the Friday morning session. The 9th box had just been pushed onto the floor of one truck when headlights came on simultaneously from 3 directions. 7 or 8 men emerged from between the rows of containers. Rocco came last with his hands in his coat pockets, and he stopped where the high floodlights cast a circle across the damp concrete. He said those boxes wouldn't leave the harbor. Gideon stepped down from the truck. Sal walked beside him. Rocco looked at Sal, then pulled a bundle of papers folded in half from his pocket and threw it onto the nearest wooden crate. He said that before anyone spoke about right and wrong, the entire harbor should know who was standing beside whom. The papers contained records of telephone calls and meetings, dates, times, and locations extending over a long period between Salvatore Bianchi and several numbers belonging to federal offices. Rocco said the man who had spent 40 years in that house had sat with federal agents more times than he had sat down to eat with his own family. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Someone cursed. Gideon picked up the papers and read them, and for those 30 seconds, he didn't look at Sal. Those 30 seconds lasted longer than the 2 years he had lived above the laundromat. Then Sal spoke. He didn't deny a single line. He said he had made the calls. He said he had called for the first time during the fall of that year, after hearing at the head of that table that a decision had been made to give the chair to someone else, and that the arrangements were almost complete. He said he hadn't given the federal agents a single document, a single name, or a single number. He had done only one thing. Whenever the investigation was about to fade, he had allowed something small enough to slip out, just enough to keep it alive. He said that as long as the case remained open, no one in that house would dare touch the man named in it. He said he had kept the freeze order alive, and the freeze order had kept Gideon alive. Rocco said those were the words of a traitor caught in the act. One of the men on his side shoved Sal, and another raised his arm, but the punch stopped in the middle of its swing because Gideon had stepped between them. He didn't seize anyone's hand. He simply stood there unarmed between the 2 lines of men, and everything came to a halt. He turned toward the powerfully built man leading the group on the other side, and called him by name. He asked whether the man's mother was well. He reminded him of the months she had spent in the treatment ward on Ashland Street, and reminded him that throughout that time, someone had paid her hospital bills regularly, without missing a single month, and that the man had never asked who it was. Gideon said that now he knew. He said he wasn't asking the man to do anything. He was only asking him to step aside. The man remained still for a long time. Then he took one step to the left, and the men behind him followed, opening a path between the two groups that led directly to the trucks. Rocco said nothing more. Sal walked to the wooden crate. He removed the ring of keys from his belt and placed it on the crate. Then he took the ring from the fourth finger of his right hand, the ring he had worn for so long that the skin beneath it was paler than the rest, and placed it beside the keys. He said he had entered that house at 16 years old, sweeping the floors of the cold storage warehouse and eating what remained from the day shift's meals. He said he had sworn loyalty to the Ferraro name, and that he had honored that oath every single day for 40 years. Then he looked directly at Rocco and said he had never sworn loyalty to Rocco alone. The two trucks reached the lawyer's office before there was enough light to make out a person's face, and before 8 o'clock on Friday morning, a complete analysis of the entire transfer chain was on Marlene Ruiz's desk, along with a list of everyone authorized to issue user accounts within the internal system. All three empty intermediary entities had been established through the same business services office, and during that same quarter, the office had also handled the registration of 2 Hale Group subsidiaries. Federal investigators had already been monitoring Hale Group's shell accounts for weeks, and by Friday morning, forensic analysis of the server logs confirmed that the 2:17 a.m. login session had routed through an external proxy, completely bypassing the terminal at the Harbor Medical Station. When Preston Hale was brought in for formal questioning, faced with traced IP logs and impending wire fraud indictments, his defense quickly collapsed. He claimed he had only supplied the corporate shells, pointing the finger directly at Camille Ashford. When Camille was brought in hours later and confronted with his testimony, she surrendered her encrypted phone, revealing months of archived messages detailing Preston's step-by-step orchestration of the breach. By late afternoon, with the digital paper trail fully verified by federal agents, the prosecutor's office formally dropped all pending charges against Josie before the grand jury was even impaneled. She signed the remaining papers, thanked them, then walked down the corridor and left the federal building through the front entrance in broad daylight, with no one walking on either side of her. Rocco Ferraro also spent half of that morning inside the same building. He was questioned about the authority to issue user accounts, the telephone calls, and his relationship with the business services office. He answered every question slowly and fully, yet none of his answers ever touched the question being asked. His signature appeared nowhere. There wasn't a single message from him. No one implicated him, because Preston knew only the intermediary name, and Camille had never met Rocco even once. At noon, he stood, thanked them, and left through the same door Josie had just passed through. He stopped on the steps to adjust his collar, and he saw his nephew standing there. His expression didn't change. He merely said the table had already decided, that the girl had left as well, and that by now his nephew had lost both his house and his woman. Then he said that he, on the other hand, was still there. He walked down the steps, and a car pulled up to the curb to collect him. The following Monday, Josie returned to work. No one mentioned what had happened, and the stack of unfinished files from the day she had been interrupted remained untouched on her desk. She sat down and began sorting them again from the beginning. They were old applications, some submitted many years before, their paper brittle along the edges and the typed words fading wherever the ink had been thin. She read them one by one, made notes in the margins, and arranged them into 3 separate piles. By the middle of the afternoon, she opened a thin file and stopped at the line naming the construction site, Kedzie Yards. She sat motionless for a long time with the paper in her hands. She had heard that name as a child, heard it from her mother, heard it during telephone calls her mother conducted in a low voice in the hallway so Josie wouldn't hear, and she had heard it for the final time during the summer when everything in their home changed forever. She turned the page. She searched the file list for other cases connected to the same construction site, and in the space identifying the applicant on another file, she found a name she also knew, Kemp, Walter. That afternoon, she went directly to the residential complex on the south side where the old man had moved after leaving the hospital. He was watering several potted plants near the entrance. She handed him the paper without saying anything. Walter set down the watering can. He looked at the paper, then sat on the front steps and asked her to sit beside him. He said he had meant to tell her for a long time, that he had intended to tell her from the day he heard the nurse read her surname aloud in the hospital room, and that every time she walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, he had swallowed the words once again. He said he had been the safety supervisor at that construction site. Then he went inside the house, and returned with an old envelope whose corners had worn thin. Inside were 3 yellowed sheets of paper, 3 requests. Each contained the same message, written several weeks apart, and each demanded that construction in the eastern section be halted so the entire scaffolding locking system could be replaced. Every request bore Walter's signature at the bottom, and each carried a red stamp in the upper corner showing that it had been received. He said he had carried the copies out of the construction site in his coat pocket because he had worked long enough to know that papers sitting in someone else's drawer didn't belong to him. Afterward, he had filed complaints. He had gone to several offices and knocked on several doors, and what he received in return was a letter dismissing him from his job, followed by interviews where people invited him in with great courtesy and then never called him again. He said that profession had closed its doors to him in the fall of that year, and he had driven a bus on the night route until he retired. Josie held the 3 sheets of paper in her hands and couldn't speak. Walter looked out toward the street for a while, then said he had written 3 times, and his only regret was that he hadn't written a 4th. He sat there knowing with perfect clarity that on the night he collapsed on the cold sidewalk, the person who knelt beside him and held on to his life was the daughter of the man he had failed to save. That night, she returned to her rented room and sat on the edge of the bed with the 3 requests resting on her lap, then took her father's tape measure from the cloth bag. She had kept it with her since the day she returned the house key through the mail slot, and she still reached for it out of habit whenever she needed something to hold on to. She turned it over in her hands, and this time, she saw what she had been looking at for years, without ever truly seeing. A long crack ran across the plastic cover on the back, and the edge wasn't jagged from a fall. It was straight and clean, as though someone had pried it open and pressed it back into place. She worked her fingernail beneath the edge. The cover popped free. Inside, wrapped around the metal spindle and pressed tightly against the coiled measuring tape, was a brown piece of paper folded into quarters. She unfolded it very slowly because the paper was brittle, and she was afraid it would tear along the creases. It was her father's handwriting. He had written in pencil using capital letters, the handwriting of a man more accustomed to marking measurements on wood than writing words on paper. It listed the identification number of the scaffolding locking system, including the complete code and manufacturer's designation. It gave the location, the eastern section. It recorded the date he had submitted his final report and the name of the person to whom he had handed it. At the bottom was one brief line, written as though he had hurriedly added it before climbing back up. "If anything happens, give this to someone willing to read it." Then came his signature. Josie sat motionless. She had held that tape measure in her hands so many times. She had placed it in her bag when she left the house. She had set it on the table in her rented room every night. Throughout all those years, the one thing capable of overturning everything had rested only a thin layer of plastic away from her fingertips. The following morning, she didn't call anyone. She didn't call the lawyer, didn't call the 3rd floor, and didn't send a message to the man upon whom she had placed that condition. She put on her coat, took the bus downtown, and went directly to the federal building through the same door she had walked out of the day before. She told the person at the desk that she needed to see federal prosecutor Marlene Ruiz, and that she would sit and wait for as long as necessary. Miss Ruiz received her nearly 2 hours later. Josie placed Walter's 3 yellowed requests on the desk, then laid the paper folded into quarters on top, and pushed everything toward her. Marlene Ruiz read the 3 requests first. She read quickly, nodded several times, and was beginning to say something about comparing them with the original records when her hand reached the smaller piece of paper. She opened it. She read from the top to the bottom, and when her eyes reached the final line and the signature beneath it, she sprang out of her chair. The chair slid backward and struck the filing cabinet behind her. She stood there with the paper still in her hand and said nothing for so long that Josie had to ask whether she was all right. Marlene Ruiz said the first case she had ever taken, when she was still a young lawyer at a free legal aid office, had been a compensation claim filed by a widow whose husband had fallen at a construction site. She said she had been certain she would win, and she had lost, and she had never understood why the compensation had been approved on paper, yet never reached anyone. She said she left legal aid after that case, joined the prosecutor's office, and had followed the Ferraro name from that day until now, without ever once sitting down to ask herself whose debt she was trying to collect. She looked at Josie. Then she said she knew exactly where that money had gone, and had known for a long time. What she had never possessed was a document proving that the man who signed the order to continue construction had known the locking system was defective before anyone fell. She raised the paper and said this was that proof. Josie asked whether it was enough to reach him. Marlene Ruiz said there was nothing else in the world that could reach him, and the person who had brought it to her wasn't anyone's lawyer or anyone from that house, but the daughter of the worker who had fallen. She arrived late that afternoon, and they still allowed her to walk straight up to the 3rd floor without asking any questions. Gideon was standing beside the window with a folder in his hands, and when he saw her, he set it down. Josie didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room with both hands in her coat pockets and asked him one question. She asked how long he had known. He didn't ask what she meant. He looked at her and said 11 days. She nodded slowly, like someone receiving a number she had already guessed, and only needed to hear spoken aloud before she could believe it. She said that during those 11 days, she had sat across from him 4 times. She said she had held other people's applications in her hands and read every line until late at night, and he had stood right there knowing the truth. He said he had intended to tell her once he found enough documents, so she wouldn't have to receive the news with empty hands. Josie said that was precisely where he had gone wrong. She said he had once again decided for her how much she could endure and how much she couldn't, exactly as he had done with that other woman for 6 years, and she asked whether he had ever consulted anyone about anything in his entire life. She said she didn't need someone to hold the truth for her until it was beautiful enough to be handed back. She said her father had died because people sitting above had decided for those below them what they should be allowed to know and what they shouldn't, and she didn't want to live with another man like that, even if he did it because he cared for her. Gideon didn't argue with a single word. He said he was sorry, and he said he would never do it again. She said she believed he truly meant that. Then she turned and walked out, and he didn't try to stop her, and the door closed very softly behind her. The following morning, in a small room inside the federal building, Gideon signed a deferred prosecution agreement with the prosecutor's office. He accepted 3 years of supervision, agreed to the forfeiture of most of his family's assets, so they could be transferred directly into the restitution fund for families whose loved ones had suffered accidents at old construction sites, and accepted a period of community service that his lawyers had tried to reduce until he told them not to ask. He left the building close to noon. It was November, and the wind moved along the street, and he wore the plain wool coat that someone had once laughed at him for wearing. He walked down the steps. Josie was waiting at the bottom. She hadn't brought flowers or anything else. She said nothing about forgiveness, didn't say she understood, and didn't say everything was all right. She only looked at him and asked whether he wanted to walk to the bus stop with her. He said yes. They walked beside each other along the street without saying anything more, then waited for the number 9 bus beneath a rusted metal shelter among other people who were also waiting to go home. 3 years later, as Gideon completed his period of supervision, the house Josie's mother had paid for through mornings spent baking became a free community clinic, and the sign hanging above the front porch bore the name Fletcher. Josie was the head nurse there, having completed the degree she had once abandoned, and she still traveled to work on the same old bus route. Walter sat at the reception desk every day in a neatly pressed shirt, and he remembered the name of every person who walked through the door. A young boy with asthma received a new inhaler, grinned as he showed it to his mother, then ran into the backyard to play with his friends. Among the people waiting to receive restitution checks was an elderly worker who noticed the tape measure clipped to Josie's belt. He stood there for a long time, then told her that he had been only a few steps away from her father that morning, and that he still remembered Ray as the only man on the crew who insisted that everyone check their safety lines before climbing. One morning, a thick envelope appeared on the reception desk with no sender's name. Inside was cash in the exact amount Josie had given the hospital cashier that night, and only much later did someone tell her that the night route bus drivers who had once worked with Walter had quietly gathered the money among themselves. The wedding was held in the clinic's backyard. It was small, attended only by people from the neighborhood and several workers from the old harbor. Walter walked Josie down the aisle because her father was no longer there. Before they reached the place where she was to stand, he handed her a small box. Inside was her mother's wedding ring, the one Josie had been forced to sell at a pawn shop to pay the electric bill during a winter long ago, the one Walter had spent months searching for with his own retirement money. He told her that she had saved his life with everything she possessed, and this was all he had to give in return. As for the woman who had thrown divorce papers into her husband's face on that Tuesday morning, those 3 years had taught her a quiet lesson. Letters still arrived at her former address from time to time, and people said that in the community facility where she served her sentence, She had finally learned the value of honest labor. This story leaves us with several very simple lessons. Never measure a person's worth by the coat they wear or the car they drive, because what truly makes someone who they are lies in a place ordinary eyes can't see. Kindness given when we have plenty is easy, but kindness given when we have nothing left is true kindness, and that kind of goodness always finds its way home. Power and money have real meaning only when they are used to return what was taken from others, not to crush those who have caused us pain. And finally, silence born from love is still silence, because truth is the foundation of every home, and love without truth will eventually crack. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that more stories of kindness can reach more people every day. How do you feel about Josie and Gideon's story? If you were in their place, would you choose to stay or walk away? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We read every story you share and sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health and many joyful, peaceful, and serene days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next story.